Thank you so much, and beautiful introduction. So we felt like we've had a lot of really great, rich experiences shared and pragmatic, actionable solutions. So we're going to build on those foundations and offer some new areas of exploration. So if I can ask our panelists to share with you one or two initiatives that you're currently involved in that you would welcome input from the World City community going forward.
This is very typical. You go. No, you go. Okay, I'll go. Thank you so much for this question, Margaret. I think I wear several hats, as many of us do these days. But the one that I'd like to bring to this community possibly is the work I do in the space of civic tech, so civic technology, which is a bunch of innovators across the world. I specifically work with the African Network of mainly digital innovators, but other kinds of innovators as well, who are really trying to do innovation for public good in various ways and at various scales. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a really exciting model and platform for us to think about city making.
Good. Farah?
So hi everyone, I am an engineer, a climate strategist. I live and work in Dubai, United Arab Emirates, and my projects goes across Saudi Arabia, UAE, and South Africa. I'm also the author of a children's book, Mission Zero. It's AI generated, but human beings had to intervene to make it possible. Mm-hmm. And then also I'm author of another book called Net Zero City. It's the Middle East region's first book on decarbonization, but it brings in my work across 4 continents because I started my journey in US, UK, Southeast Asia, and now in Middle East. So thank you for being here.
Great. And we had a couple of conversations in preparing for this, and Farah and I got quite deep into water scarcity. And when I read her young adult book, Mission Zero, last night, what blew my mind was the data point that people have more access to mobile phones than to clean water. And you know, I worry about the paralysis that can happen when we use the word climate emergency. So Farah, if you can kind of talk about the cognitive challenge of dealing with the climate emergency and how do you enable people to move forward, not be paralyzed?
Thank you so much. So my work focuses on decarbonization, strategies and implementation. I'm an engineer, I love spreadsheets, so whatever strategy I work on, it has to be implementable. And then I work with business modeling of the implementation of those strategies in the city level. So food, energy and water nexus, this triangle is something I focus on and I work on. And the reason for writing this book because the conversations currently happening across the globe is how do we decarbonize our cities. The latest net zero stocktake report, which was issued in 2023, and COP28, which I was a technical director for delivering COP28 for the UAE government, it's very evident that 240 cities have signed up for net zero commitments, but only 60 cities, 60 cities have some level of net zero strategies on board. And yesterday we had brilliant speakers who are from those cities who are actually doing something. So many of my work is focusing on working with private sector, public sector, and government to understand the policies, to create pilot case studies of implementation of these policies, working with a lot of tech providers on the ecosystem, and then working with the business modeling, like how do you create a sustainable business model of a sustainable solution that is low in emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, and all these coming together. So this is kind of the essence of my work.
But it's very actionable. But how do you ensure empathy as well as this hard data, right? Because you're actually a very big-hearted person. So as you're building bridges between public and private sector, how do you ensure people act with empathy and compassion?
So thank you so much for the question. That's the very reason I wrote the Net Zero City book, because I realized that many engineers like me work in the built environment who are very technically capable, but oftentimes the local general public misses the definitions. So the idea is, how do you tell a story in a meaningful way? So most of my work, I do a lot of voluntary work with youth organizations. is to simplify and demystify net zero, carbon neutral, all these different definitions that's out there. And the way I do it is engaging with public. I do a lot of voluntary work, but also writing books and simplifying it. So this Net Zero City book, it was self-published, and I thought nobody's going to read it. It was 10,000 copies sold. Idea is not selling the book. The idea is that people read it and then got back to me with solutions and problems, which was absolutely fantastic, because then I could reach out and engage. So creating that ripple effect and the impact and influence is very important, but also telling the story in a very simple way, so it's relatable.
And what was the single most surprising reaction you got from the young adult book so far?
So the reason I wrote the young adult book, which is Mission Zero, is because when I work on decarbonization strategies, people often think energy is the biggest problem. But I live in a desert where we cannot grow food because we don't have enough water. The water we get on the tap is from the sea desalinated. 60% of UAE's energy generation is used on having water that we can't really eat but have on our tap. So it came from the idea that food, energy, and water nexus is connected. And to decarbonize our cities, we have to understand the interrelationship. And I started with children, so the book is for 8 to 12-year-old. And when I realized that if children are the future leaders, and if they could understand, they're very bright, and they can come up with better solutions that we can't even think of today. So that's what inspired me to write the book and to work with the young children, so to prepare them, because climate emergency should not create scarcity mindset. It should be looked as opportunity, because if I look at the business objective point of view, climate is a 33 trillion US dollar industry, investment industry for next 30 years. So how do you shift the mindset of a systems thinking, solution-based approach that has ideas and imagination, but also implementation? So that's where the idea came from.
Yep, thank you. And so, Geci, you made clear that people should not be considered statistics or data points. How do you balance this humanistic instinct with the desire to scale change?
So I don't know if it requires a balance. I think the scale is in those human data points and statistics, you know. So I've been in a lot of meeting rooms and workshops where we talk about saving the world and scaling, where a few of us are going to do it for the billions. And I often ask, and what will the billions be doing while you are doing that? And so I think we've got scale. I think we've got a world full of energetic, imaginative young people who just don't have access to the resources to do the things they'd want to do. And not all of the things they'd want to do are good or meaningful, but there's plenty out there. And so I think that's the switch I'm trying to encourage through my work, is to see how can we really have different modes of participation and inclusion that aren't about inclusion as the objective of what we are doing, but as the means through which we do it. I think it's possible.
And Farah just mentioned scarcity mindset, Geci. So how do you deal with that?
Yeah, well, so there are a lot of people I've looked up to in this space in terms of thinking about the resource we have access to. So there's an several interesting models out of India, for example, the Ecoversities model that says, actually, if you're in a university like I do, you think that, oh, we don't have enough teachers. And then the question they ask is, but how many teachers do we have? It depends on who you define as teacher, right? Because if you think about it, there are many, many teachers, and that is a difference from a scarcity mindset that just looks at, well, who has a PhD degree and can therefore qualify to teach people, because they ask, you know, how do you teach love? How do you teach us how to die? How do you teach us how to live well? You don't need a PhD to teach those things. There's a lot of biological learning, as Jinan B talks about. So that's an example of it. I think in the space of imagination, we've got this idea that we invest a lot of R&D into brilliant lab coats and technologists like many of us here, but imagination and creativity comes from so many different places. I was just talking to somebody the other day about everybody loves watching The Boy Who Harnessed the Wind. Well, he didn't have a PhD to do that, but clearly he had imagination, creativity, and a need to do something. And if we begin to understand that, then I think we begin to see the abundance of imagination around us and actually the scarcity that holds it back.
And Geci, when you talk about civic tech in Africa, do you think civic tech is evolving on a distinctive track in Africa compared to India and other markets? Like, can you compare or contrast civic tech in Africa?
Yeah, so, and we were talking about this earlier because, there's obviously the whole social enterprise idea that in a way is, if you want a reframing perhaps of a commercial model, basically. The civic techers, I feel like, often do very much the same work but have a different approach to capital, which is also interesting, not necessarily quite sustainable as a business model yet, because it tends to be very dependent on philanthropy or, probably unsustainable modes of funding. But it's values driven. And I don't think that's different across the regions from what I'm seeing. I think civic tech has developed in different ways in different regions for various reasons. So in North America, which is actually where it began, I think comes out of a very particular space and also relationship between the citizen and the state. What we've seen in Africa is quite similar to Latin America, actually, and I feel like we've been a lot on their trajectory. Asia, I think, is also quite different from us, both in scale and what causes it to happen. But I do think what we have in common is this value-driven approach that says, look, we are accountable to each other and to our communities, not necessarily to the money that's paying for what we're doing.
And this accountability to each other, how do you measure that?
So in our case, it's very peer-driven in Africa. So we have something called the Civic Tech Innovation Network. So it's a system, if you want, that people voluntarily subscribe to. There is no form to fill or anything to complete, but they're extremely accountable to each other. So I will get an email, for example, saying that this organization did this and that's not cool. And then what we call the reference group will have a conversation about it, and we will literally blacklist somebody and say, well, we're not working with that person because they don't comply with the accountability framework we've all agreed to. So if you know the makers community or the makers networks, who are also a really amazing kind of community, I think we've got many of these decentralized sort of autonomous communities forming, and they work. And this is not just a model, I think, that refers to, that's in the civic tech space. If you look at Equity Bank, I think is one of the examples I gave to you, there is an increase in these trust-based systems that are actually being commercialized, including in banking, where you used to have to come and say that you had, this collateral, and this kind of, money behind you or this kind of track record. And now a bank can accept peer support for, yes, please fund Farah, she's a good person.
Right.
And they're getting all their money back. We're also seeing it with financing to informal traders, where the default rates are lower than to the very formal, very procedure-driven relationships that investors would typically have with clients. So I think that's what we're seeing in our space, is trust-based networks, and they seem to work. People are accountable.
And I think the World City Movement is just a brilliant forum for expanding trust networks. And last question on this track, Geci, if you could talk about with civic activism, to what extent do you think it's important to work within like a master framework, and how much autonomy do you think these networks should have?
Yes, so I love that you said master framework and not master plan, because as a trained planner, I came very much from the tradition of master planning. We've got to have a grand plan and a strategy, and everybody has to know, and you've got to have a log frame, and you've got to know exactly what you're going to do, when, how much it'll cost, and what the output will be, and how that output will achieve the outcome. That's kind of what I'm trained in. I don't believe we need that.
Okay.
I do believe we need to have some view as to what we think we're doing, but I think we're very much, when you're innovating, you're in the mode of experimentation, and you want to encourage imagination. I really don't want to encourage for city building the kind of work that reproduces the kind of cities we already have. We need something different. You can't do something different by doing things the same way, and therefore we can't hold people to that. So I do think you need a framework. We do need some sense of, otherwise how do we hold ourselves accountable, right? So whether it's a value-based framework or whether it's a common vision, the big picture, what are we trying to do and how do we do things around here? But within that, I think we really have to create a lot more room for experimentation, for making mistakes, for giving the feedback. So Leon Firth talks about anticipatory governance systems that really work as systems. And the feedback loops is how you learn and how you course correct. But I don't think it has to be a blueprint, master plan, fixed, where the hurdles even to get involved in innovating are so high that you automatically exclude the billions. And then, yes, the three of us can try and change the world.
Right. as an investor, I always like to land on, an action plan with accountability. So let's have some fun. If we were talking about blended finance earlier today, if you received a grant for $10 million today, how would you allocate that capital, Farah?
So, as mentioned, there's 60 cities in the world have a net zero plan, and the rest don't. But many cities have made commitment, 240 cities. So, from my perspective, it would be coming up with a climate regulation, and funding or identifying technologies and innovation that already exist in the ecosystem to create, okay, how do we get this policy in real life? How do we transfer this policy? For example, if it's an energy reduction target of 65%, okay, how do we do this in the year one because we are building 10,000 properties, for example? And then testing that technology, innovation, supply chain, materials, whatever those ingredients are, with a small group doing a pilot case study, and then understanding and learning and feedback loop of, okay, this was investment, this is the outcome, these are the lessons learned. Now, do we need to change the policy, or how can we mass scale it? So this feedback loop circularity of climate financing and net zero transition coming together. So if I do a summary of what I just said, it's how do you decarbonize or create a net zero readiness for your city with a specific timeline and a budget, and have an action plan. So having the whole business case for transition of net zero. That would be my ultimate one. I would like to add one more challenge in it. It's the cognitive challenge. Because current climate data, youth don't understand, public don't understand. And for the last 30 years, the built environment thought it's the climate scientist that's going to change the world. But in last 10 years, we realized that no, it's not just smart cities, we need climate smart cities. And we all have a responsibility. I think the reason why many of us still think it's climate scientist who's going to save the world is because lack of ownership and responsibility. So clarity of ownership, responsibility is important. And then identifying, okay, what is a pilot case study that can we implement, draw lessons from, and then who are the partners we can work with. So I think co-creation, clarity of vision, measurability, accountability, KPIs are very important. So just look at, essentially it's a business plan, an implementation of a tangible solution for the people, but then understanding, okay, how do we mass scale it? So for me, that would be very effective.
Thank you. And Geci, same question. If you were awarded a $10 million grant today, how would you allocate that capital?
So I knew this question was coming. And what I did is, true to my orientation to ask the civic, I thought, let me ask the civic, what do they think we should do with this money? So if we have the bag, what are we going to do? So I put out a quick survey on my LinkedIn group and just gave people a couple of days to say, okay, what do we do with this money, guys? So got over about 60 responses within a few days, which is perfect. And I've kind of been trying to analyze through them, and I think there's probably 4 categories of responses, right? And I like these responses. There's some that were very quick to say, look, there are specific projects or programs or prototypes we need to put this money into immediately. And there's some good ideas there. Cool cities, how do we have the 40-degree Celsius house? How do we do that? Nature-based solutions, ecosystem services, water programs. So some really cool projects and ideas, many of which are already happening. Recycling, so waste to energy, waste to product. So lots of that. The second category was very institutional, around how do we build institutions, how do we create ministries of climate change, how do we build capacities and skills in the right places. So there was an institutional category, let's improve the institutions, and that's what we're going to do with the 10 million. The third category was, and research, there was some research in that bundle. Then the other one I think was really interesting was around ecosystems and instruments, saying, look, we've got to strengthen the ecosystem. Something is broken and it's not quite working, and therefore let's use that. And that way people were saying, we're going to get 10 times 10. So this is how we're going to scale, because if you strengthen the ecosystems, then it's not just 10 million we're working with. We're going to actually get scale very quickly. There were very specific models. So Professor Gillian Marcel, for example, had her 3B model that was about blended financing, bottlenecks, and I can't remember what was the third B. Oh, blind spots. Very specific models. So people have models already of what we could do with the 10 million, right? And that would help strengthen ecosystems. The third category was really interesting. That was the other B, the bullshit category. So this category said that, look, we've already spent trillions, or a trillion at least, on climate finance. Emissions are still going up. You're not going to change anything. 10 million is not enough. Actually, you've got to change people. We've got to change the mindsets. We've got to change something about the way our spirits are working, because there's something that's not adding up, and therefore 10 million isn't going to change that. We need to do something that's more than just finance. I think this range was really interesting. So my suggestion is, since I'm the one who's got the 10 million, is let's do what Real Miller says, like walk on two legs. He's the former head of foresight at UNESCO. He talks about walking on two legs. I think let's put some of it into some of these practical things people are saying, but not too much of it, because there's a lot of money already going into that stuff and we're not moving fast enough. But let's agree that there's some good stuff that needs to continue being supported. But let's put a chunk of it, I would venture to say even the majority, into something that's a lot more exploratory, that gets us to deal with why we don't change. And I think that's probably got to do with the more bottlenecks, just making funding. So I think some of the instrument ideas were interesting. People were talking about either small grants or different approaches to how we do a different kind of microfinance with this. So break it down actually into smaller bits, which funders don't like.
Yep.
So the answer there is change the way funders fund. Fund people, fund processes, not just projects.
That's great. And could you expand on how do you change people's mindset? That's tricky.
Well, I think one of the ways to change people's mindsets is to get them to believe they have agency at all. We all read these headlines and we see, I turned on the TV this morning and the hurricane is like, was it hurricane? At least it's a man's name this time. This hurricane is wreaking havoc in Florida, and I'm sure we all see these disasters all the time. It's Japan, it's Yemen, it's Bangladesh, it's just everywhere. And you probably feel, if you're sitting in a community somewhere without the resources to be on a stage, that you can't really do anything, and you begin to have this climate anxiety, and you believe you don't have any agency. I think one of the ways to shift mindset is not necessarily to convince people that there's climate change, but is to convince people that you are here, you can do something, and in fact the systems aren't against you, that actually you can be enabled to think about what you see around you and what you feel you can do, and that matters. I think that's a good mindset change to have.
Can I add something to that?
Please.
I think many times we feel that we and climate, it's two separate things. We don't feel part of it. Even though we live in the biome and all that, we don't sometimes connect to it. And linking back to what Geci is saying, that connection is very important. Whether we consciously do it or we do it through a group, just knowing that I can make a difference, however small or big is, that mindset makes a big difference. We often think that I am too small, I'm just one person and it's not enough. I think the government should do it, or the climate scientists should do it, and I think shifting of that mindset has started. We just need to jumpstart it a bit faster.
And Farah, how do you find yourself targeting nature as an ally?
So I work for the world's largest infrastructure company, and we know that from now till 2050, 250 billion meters square of floor area is going to be built globally, which is building, and right now, the way construction market is growing, we are building the city a size of Paris every single week. Wow. Not just my company, globally.
Yeah.
Also, working for an infrastructure company, we know that whatever we touch, whether it's roads, bridges, buildings, it's going to be there for next 50 to 100 years. So what we have done is 5 years ago, as a company, we identified an ESG strategy called Sustainable Legacies. We did not call it ESG strategy. And the idea of the strategy is to look at decarbonization, to look at social impact, to look at carbon as a big conversation, the whole life carbon process from building to construction. Last year, the first carbon regulation came out globally, which looks at the carbon life cycle of construction projects. My voice is giving up.
Yeah.
So, as a construction company, we know that we can't stop construction processes across the globe. But what we can do is work with architects, urban planners, engineers to make conscious decisions looking at material supply chain. So that's the biggest contribution we're doing at the moment, looking at whole life carbon processes. Sometimes the clients don't ask for it, but we do it anyways to provide that cost and carbon modeling. This is where the fun starts. When the client sees that if you pay 5% more, your return of investment in 2 years is 20% or higher, they go for it. Before, we didn't have the tools to show that.
Right, that's really amazing. And just to follow up, on the material science side, where do you tune into, like in terms of experimentation, that you think your company may be able to mainstream some of these solutions over time?
So clients wants to see something tangible. So essentially, it's me or my team sit with the client and show them each design decisions they're making, what is the impact of the cost. So that's why we call it cost and carbon modeling. So for example, if we're building the Bilbao Museum again, we'll sit with the client and say every material in that building, it's a 3D model, client can change everything, architects can change everything. And when they see real life model, which they walk through with a 3D visualizations or a 5D camera, and they're inside the model, and every decisions they're making has an impact on cost and carbon, it changes the conversation. They're blown away. Many times when architects and urban planners, we show the visualization, we don't often as a client, it's very hard for them to go inside. But when you walk through your building in a 3D camera and then you realize the impact and decisions has an impact on cost and carbon, that's fantastic. And it's an aha moment. So as an engineer, aha moment in a client's eyes is amazing for me, because that's when we encourage them to make conscious decisions which has a lower carbon footprint, but also has a business modeling behind it.
It sounds like a really great way to get buy-in too, right? Because they own the decision.
Yes.
So, Geci, I would like to pick up on a point raised yesterday by Tiffany in Melbourne, talking about how cities are close to citizens and maybe the most effective way to change behavior in communities. But you've worked with regional infrastructure, national cities. How do you navigate the political minefields that you encounter in cities, and do you prefer kind of cities, national structures, regional structures?
Yeah. So I've kind of come to believe that you possibly need them all, and that's probably a scaling issue. I do think the local level is incredibly important, because at the local level, and we talk about specificity, and that came through with a lot of the projects yesterday. If you're experiencing the 40 degrees, then you don't need somebody at the capital who's cozy in 20 degrees telling you that you're okay when you're not, right? But your mayor also knows you're not okay because they live there with you. And I think there is something about what inspires local leadership, and I think we heard some of those stories yesterday. I do think there's something about the aspirations of communities that are much more connected because they're on the ground. And so I think the local level of government really matters. I do think it's the most problematic level of government because it's extremely political in a fairly dangerous kind of political way on the ground. But I think it's so important because that's where the connection is, that's where the trust needs to be built, that's where unique things can happen, place-based, hyper-local. I think regional is important though, because we're not islands, and I think what we don't want is for people to kind of navel gaze constantly and be inefficient. We saw in South Africa, for example, when we began trying to do integrated development planning, that was a really good idea for localizing and decentralizing, but what it did is that every town and city then wants to have an airport and wants to have, so every place wants to build itself up to be New York. And we don't need that either. So there is a need to take a regional view on, okay, where are the efficiencies, and how do you get the connectivity going? National governments, time will tell whether they survive, but I suppose for now, we need them for some of the big fiscal control, some of the regulation that is actually quite inefficient and difficult to do locally. So when we talk about smart cities or any of those approaches, there's some stuff with the big infrastructure that's just either too costly or too inefficient to only do locally, and we do need, I suppose, some of that. So I see the need for all those scales, but I do feel the power currently is probably organized in the wrong direction. I think things are very, very top-down. It'd be great to see that turn around.
Can I just add one point? I think it's very important, bringing on to Geci's point, we need to redefine what good looks like. That's going to shift the business model. That's going to shift the business as usual, because it's so important and it's so relevant that we have to redefine the new business model for climate finance and climate transition. So we really have to find a new definition of good.
Well, I think you're leaving everyone with a reason to reconnect and continue the conversation. Thank you both for your candid observations, and thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.